Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Paul and with the Dicey Review, and today we're going to be learning how to play the 1 to 4 player game Harmonies. In this game, players will be creating different habitats and landscapes on their player boards to hopefully draw in animals and gather the most victory points. How does it play? Let's get to the table and find out. Harmonies comes with all of the components that you see here, including a central board, 4 personal boards, a score pad, 120 tokens, 4 reminder cards, 32 animal cards and 10 nature spirit cards, a number of animal cubes, and a cloth bag. To begin setup, place the supply board in the middle of the table. Then give each player a personal board, and give each player a reminder card if that would be helpful. Then take all of the tokens and place them in the bag, and place the bag within easy reach near the play area. Then from the bag, draw 3 tokens and place them on each of the empty spaces around the central supply board. Place the animal cubes near the play area within easy reach of all players. Shuffle the deck of animal cards, and then deal 5 face up in the play area to form a supply. After this, you're ready to play. And first player in this game is the last person to have seen a magnificent landscape, or you can just decide randomly. In Harmonies, players will be building different landscapes by placing colored tokens and creating habitats for their animals. The goal of the game is to do this most effectively to get the most victory points. At the end of the game, each different type of landscape will score differently depending on how players have placed it on their player board. Trees will give players points based on how high they're stacked at the end of the game. You have to stack trees on top of wood, and they can go potentially up to 3 spaces high. So for instance, if you played one more wood piece here and then topped it off with a tree, it would be worth 7 points at the end of the game. Trees that are stacked on top of 1 wood would be worth 3 points at the end of the game, and trees that are stacked on the ground by themselves are worth 1 victory point. It's important to note at the end of the game you won't score any points for wood with no trees covering it. Mountains will score in a similar way as trees. You can stack them up to 3 spaces high, but mountains will only score if they're connected to other mountains at the end of the game. So for instance, this mountain that's stacked 3 spaces high would score 7 points, and this mountain for 1 stack would score 1 point because they're both connected to another mountain. This mountain, however, would score this player no points unless they connect it to this mountain range here. Fields will score 5 points for each field that's at least 2 tokens big. And it doesn't matter how big the field is, as long as it has at least 2 tokens in it, it's still 5 points. So for instance, this field is 5 points even though there's more than 2 in that field. This field wouldn't score any points unless a player were to come back and place another field there, for instance. Now each field would be worth 5 points. If a player were to come and connect this field later, it would be one big field that's worth 5 points still. Remember, as long as a field has at least 2 tokens in it, it scores 5 points no matter how big it gets. Buildings, which are the red tokens, would also score a player 5 points at the end of the game, as long as they're stacked 2 spaces high and have 3 different colors around them. Building tiles can be stacked on top of wood, other buildings, or stone. So for instance, this player could stack this building tile on top of any of these 3 tiles. At the end of the game, this building would be worth 5 points because it's surrounded by 3 different colors. And then finally, rivers at the end of the game will score points for the longest river using the shortest path. So for instance, this river would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces long. You aren't able to count both of these spaces in the river, for instance, by going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You have to choose the shortest path. And then players will score a number of points depending on the length of their river. So for instance, for a 5-length river, players would score 11 points. For a 6-length river, they would score 15, and for anything over 6, they would score 19. It's also important to note that players would only score their best river. So if you have multiple rivers, you don't score them all. Players will also be able to score points by utilizing animal cards, and we'll look at that in more detail here in a moment. Now that we've looked at the different terrain types and how they'll score at the end of the game, we'll look at the details of a player's turn. On a player's turn, they have to take and place tokens, and if they want to, they could also take one animal card and place any number of animal cubes, and we'll look at the details around placing animal cubes shortly. When taking and placing tokens, players will take all of the tokens from one of the circles on the central supply board, and then after placing all of those tokens on their player board, taking one animal card if they want to, and placing any number of the animal cubes from their animal card onto their board, 3 new tokens would be drawn from the bag to fill in the empty space, and it would then be the next player's turn in clockwise order. When placing tokens onto their player board, players can place the tokens wherever they want to on the map. They don't have to be next to each other. But they have to follow a few placement rules. Different terrain types can't be stacked on top of each other. For instance, you can't place trees on top of mountains, and once a tree is placed, nothing can be stacked on top of it. So for instance, I couldn't stack another brown piece here and then make the tree taller. You can't place anything on top of fields. You can place rocks on top of other rocks, so long as you don't exceed 3 in height. And the highest you can stack a tree is 3 high as well. So for instance, if I had these 2 wood pieces, I could then cap it off to make a 3 height tree. As a reminder, you can only stack buildings on top of rocks, wood, or other buildings, and they can only be stacked 2 high. And you also can't stack anything on top of rivers once they're placed either. Other than that, you can place your tiles freely on your player board, and there's a handy reminder on your reference sheet that shows which tiles can be stacked on top of others, how high certain tiles can be stacked, and how each tile scores at the end of the game. In addition to the mandatory action of taking tiles and placing them on your board, you also have 2 optional actions that you can take on your turn. The first optional action is to take one of the animal cards. After taking an animal card at the end of the turn, you would refill any empty spaces with a new animal card for the other players to consider. A player can only hold up to 4 animal cards above their player board at a time. If a player ever has 4 animal cards above their player board and would want to draw another, they can't unless they first clear up a spot by fully completing any of the animal cards. When a player collects an animal card, they'll fill it up with cubes from the general supply. These animal cards will show players certain patterns that they can create with their habitats to attract these specific type of animals to score more points. For instance, these penguins would like a landscape to be built like this pattern on this player's board, whereas these animals would prefer this straight pattern. If a player ever meets the conditions on the animal cards that they have in their supply, they would be able to take cubes from the bottommost space of these cards as a free action and place them on their play area to show that they've achieved one of those goals. It's important to note that if a player wants to achieve one of these goals, they have to have the matching pattern on their board exactly, meaning this player has to have these colored tiles in this shape, all only being 1 stack high. It is important to note, however, that the patterns can be rotated in any direction, and tiles from one pattern can be used in another pattern. For instance, this player here has met this pattern with this shape here. So they could take the bottommost cube and place it on this shape. This shows that they've achieved that goal, and this card would now be worth 4 points at the end of the game. The player has also met this pattern on this shape here, so they could take that cube and place it there. Now this card is worth 10 points at the end of the game. And this player has also met this pattern from this card here, so they could take this cube and place it on this spot. It is important to note that once a cube is placed on a tile, that tile is blocked and can't have any more cubes placed on top of it, and you also can't stack any other tiles on top of it. In this example, this player has also met this pattern for a 3rd time and could place their cube on this space right here. Once a card is fully emptied of cubes, it will be worth the very top value on the card at the end of the game, and it can be placed off to the side as it's fully completed, which would open up a spot for a new animal card to be taken. So once again, as a reminder, players can place as many cubes as they want to or can on their turn as an optional action. Players can only take 1 new animal card each action, however. Once a player has taken and placed tokens, taken 1 animal card if they want to, and placed as many animal cubes onto their board as they want to and can, they would refill any empty spots on the row of animal cards, and play would then pass to the next player in clockwise direction for them to take a turn. A game of Harmonies will end in one of 2 ways. If any player places a tile on their player board that would only leave 2 open spaces, that will trigger the end of the game, and players will take turns so that everyone has had equal turns. So for instance, if the start player triggered the end of the game, then this player would get 1 more turn before the game's end. If, however, this player triggered the end of the game would be over immediately as everyone has had equal turns in that example. The game can also end if the pouch is completely empty whenever new tiles need to be placed on the board. At the end of the game, players will score points based on the type of landscapes that they have and any animal cards that they can score. Players will first score for their trees. On this player's board, they have 3 2-stack trees and 1 1-stack tree for a total of 10 points. For their mountains, they have 6 connected mountains, 1 being 3 stacked high. All of these mountains are connected, which means that they would score a total of 12 points. It's important to note that if this player had had a mountain over here, for instance, since it wasn't connected to any other mountain, it wouldn't have scored. Next, the player would score their fields. This player has one field that's at least 2 spaces big, so they would score 5 points for that. Then players would score their buildings. In this example, the player has 2 buildings that are 2 stacks high, but this building only has 2 different colors around it, whereas this building has 3 different colors around it, meaning they would score this building for 5 more points. Finally, the player would score their river. They have 2 rivers on their board, but they would only score their best river. So in this instance, that would be this river, which is 4 spaces long, counting the shortest route. A 4-space river would be worth 8 points. This player would score a total of 40 points for their different landscapes. Then they would score points for their cards. They have 2 fully completed cards here, so they would score the highest visible point value, 16 and 14. And they have 2 cards here that are completed to their second level, which would give them an additional 9 and 10 points. This would give them a total of 49 points for cards, which would give them 89 points total. Whichever player has the highest point total would win, and if there's a tie, the player who's placed the most animal cubes would win, and if there's still a tie, the players would share the victory. Alright everybody, that was our video. Hopefully it was helpful and hopefully it was informative. If you still have any questions about how to play, please comment below or email me directly at thedicey@gmail.com and I'll do my best to answer those questions for you if I can. As always, if you're enjoying the content that we put out, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell icon to be notified whenever we put out new content in the future. Alright everybody, thanks so much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you at the table.